Helen Carter had never been afraid of hard work. For 3 decades, she had scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, and wiped down desks in buildings that never felt like hers. The scent of industrial cleaner clung to her skin long after she clocked out. Her hands were always raw from chemicals, her feet aching from 12-hour shifts. But none of that mattered. Because every hour, every sleepless night, every callus on her palms, it was all for him. Michael. Her boy. She had raised him alone. She had worked nights so she could be home during the day, making sure he never felt the emptiness of an absent parent. She had clipped coupons, skipped meals, and counted every last penny so he could have new shoes for school, so he wouldn't feel different from the other kids. She had whispered promises to him as he slept, soft, steady vows that his life would be better than hers. And when the letter arrived, embossed with Harvard University across the top, she had cried so hard her hands shook. Her son, her brilliant, hard-working son, was going to Harvard. The tuition was more than she had ever seen in her life. But she had never let money stop her before. She picked up extra shifts. Took on another office building. Said yes to every late-night call, every last-minute request, until sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. She sold the gold wedding band she had kept in a small box for years, not because it reminded her of love, but because it reminded her of survival. And it worked. Michael packed his bags, hugged her at the door, and promised, "I won't let you down, Mom." For 4 years, she lived for the moments he called. They became fewer and fewer as time went on, but that was normal, wasn't it? College was busy. She told herself that over and over. Then, one afternoon, a coworker at the office handed her a phone. "Hey, Helen, isn't this your boy?" She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over. The screen showed a photo, Michael in a cap and gown, beaming, surrounded by friends in pressed suits and expensive dresses. The caption read, "So proud of my Harvard man." Helen stared. She had never seen this picture before. She hadn't even known the ceremony had happened. Her son had graduated. And he hadn't told her. Her stomach tightened as she scrolled through the comments. "Congratulations. So amazing. You must be so proud, Michael." But there was nothing about her. Not one mention. Not one word. The phone felt heavy in her hand. For years, she had imagined this moment. She had pictured herself in the crowd, hands clasped, heart full, watching as he walked across the stage. Maybe he'd spot her and wave. Maybe he'd find her afterward, wrap her in a hug, whisper, "Mom, we did it." But she hadn't been there. She hadn't even been invited. Helen set the phone down carefully, her fingers trembling. Her son had left her behind. And he wasn't looking back. Helen tried not to think about it. She told herself there had to be a reason. Maybe he lost track of time. Maybe he thought she wouldn't be able to take off work. Maybe, just maybe, he had planned to call her later. So she waited. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. The phone never rang. Finally, she gave in and called him herself. It went straight to voicemail. "You've reached Michael Carter. I can't take your call right now. Please leave a message." She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile into her voice. "Hey, sweetheart. I saw the pictures. You looked so handsome in that cap and gown. I'm so proud of you. I know you must be busy, but when you get a chance, give me a call, okay?" She hung up. The call was never returned. It wasn't just the graduation. It was everything after. At first, she tried not to notice the changes. How the calls became less frequent. How the texts were shorter. How his responses started coming hours, then days, later. "Sorry, Mom, work is crazy. I'll call you soon. Big meeting today, can't talk now. Hope you're doing well." She told herself it was normal. Kids grew up. Got busy. Moved on. But then, Christmas came. For 22 years, Michael had spent Christmas Eve in their tiny apartment, helping her decorate the same artificial tree she had bought on clearance when he was 5. Even when he went off to college, he had always come home. This year, he didn't. Helen left a voicemail. Then a text. "Hey sweetheart, I was thinking of making your favorite, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes, those rolls you love. Let me know if you can come by, okay?" The message was marked as read. No response. The apartment felt quieter than it ever had before. She set the table for 2 anyway. She made his plate. She sat in silence, staring at the empty chair across from her. A week later, she saw another post. Michael, sitting in a high-end restaurant, laughing with a group of well-dressed colleagues. "Christmas with my second family." Helen felt something inside her crack. It wasn't just that he hadn't come. It was that he hadn't even thought of her. Like she didn't exist. Like she had never existed. For the first time in her life, Helen wondered if all those nights, those years of sacrifice, had meant anything at all. Months passed. Helen stopped calling. She stopped texting. She stopped waiting. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself she was fine, the ache in her chest never really went away. Then, one evening, as she was pushing her cleaning cart through the polished hallways of a downtown high-rise, she heard a laugh, sharp, familiar. She turned her head, and there he was. Michael. He stepped out of an elevator, surrounded by 2 men in crisp suits, engaged in easy conversation. His hair was styled, his watch gleamed under the bright overhead lights, and his voice carried with the smooth confidence of someone who belonged here. For a split second, Helen forgot how to breathe. It had been so long since she had seen him in person, since she had heard his voice outside of old voicemails she sometimes replayed just to remember what it sounded like. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her cart, her throat dry. Say something. Call his name. But before she could, Michael's gaze flickered toward her. Their eyes met. A beat of recognition. And then, nothing. He looked away. Not a second glance, not a hint of hesitation. Just an indifferent turn of the head as if she were another piece of the background. As if she were invisible. She watched as he continued down the hall, his voice light, his laughter easy, never once breaking stride. Helen stood frozen in place, her body rigid, her breath shallow. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, how they might run into each other, how he might smile, act surprised, ask how she had been. She had imagined the chance to forgive him, to tell him that she understood, that she was proud of him anyway. But now, watching him disappear through the glass doors at the end of the hallway, she felt something inside her harden. He had made his choice. She turned back to her cart, adjusting her gloves. There were still floors to clean, trash to empty. Life moved on. And so would she. Helen almost didn't open the envelope. It had arrived in the mail, sandwiched between bills and grocery store coupons, just another piece of paper in a life filled with obligations. She nearly tossed it aside, but the gold lettering caught her eye. The Boston Philanthropy Awards. Confused, she scanned the text until her eyes landed on a name at the bottom. Helen Carter, honored guest. She sat down hard on the couch, gripping the letter. For a long time, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she let the realization sink in. After Michael left, after the silence between them stretched from months into years, she had thrown herself into something new. It had started small, a few extra dollars set aside each month, an idea that refused to fade. Then she began reaching out, connecting with other single mothers, women like her who had sacrificed everything for their children and been left with nothing. She knew their struggles. She had lived them. And somehow, word had spread. Donations trickled in. Local businesses offered support. What had once been a quiet dream turned into something real, the Helen Carter Scholarship for Single Mothers. A second chance for women who had spent their lives giving but never receiving. And now, someone had noticed. She should have felt pride. She should have been overwhelmed with gratitude. But instead, as she ran her fingers over the embossed lettering, all she could think about was Michael. Because if she had been invited to this event, then he would be there too. For years, she had been the one in the shadows, watching from afar as he built a life without her. But now, for the first time, he would have no choice but to see her. And this time, she would be the one standing in the light. The ballroom was dazzling, grand chandeliers, polished marble floors, and tables draped in pristine white linen. Helen had never been in a place like this before. The air hummed with quiet sophistication, the clinking of champagne glasses, the murmur of conversation spoken in careful, practiced tones. She felt out of place. But she kept her chin up, her shoulders squared, reminding herself that she had earned the right to be here. Then, across the room, she saw him. Michael. He was standing near the bar, dressed in a tailored suit, engaged in quiet conversation with a senator she recognized from the news. He looked different from the boy she had raised, older, sharper, every trace of his working-class roots carefully smoothed away. He hadn't seen her yet. A voice over the microphone silenced the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor those who have dedicated their lives to uplifting others. And now, we recognize a woman whose work has changed countless lives. A woman who turned her own struggles into opportunities for others. Please welcome our next honoree, Helen Carter. Applause filled the room. Helen's breath caught, but she forced her legs to move, one step at a time. And that's when Michael saw her. She felt it, the shift in the air, the stunned expression that flickered across his face. She climbed the steps to the stage, wrapped her fingers around the podium, and steadied herself. I never thought I'd be standing here, she began, her voice even and calm. For most of my life, I was invisible. I was a single mother. I worked nights so my son could have a future. I scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, cleaned up after people who never thought twice about the woman behind the mop. The room was utterly silent. Michael stood frozen. I believed that if I sacrificed enough, if I gave everything I had, I would always have a place in my son's life, she continued. But I've learned something. Love doesn't come with guarantees. Sometimes, the people we sacrifice for don't look back. She let the words settle. Michael's fists curled at his sides. But that doesn't mean the sacrifice was wasted, she said softly. Because every mother who gets a second chance through this scholarship, every woman who refuses to give up, is proof that our worth isn't defined by the people who forget us. She paused, then smiled. It's defined by the people who remember. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Helen stood tall, absorbing the moment. And then, slowly, she let her gaze drift back to Michael. For a fleeting second, she saw something break in his expression. Regret. Shame. Maybe even grief. But Helen didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. She had built something bigger than him. Bigger than both of them. So she turned away, walked off the stage, and stepped into the future that belonged to her. And this time, she didn't look back. The applause still echoed in Helen's ears long after she left the stage. She walked back to her seat, keeping her expression poised, but inside, her heart pounded. Not from nerves. Not from regret. But from liberation. For the first time in years, she felt free. As the evening wound down, guests mingled, exchanging business cards and congratulations. A few women, other single mothers, donors who had supported her foundation, came up to her, shaking her hand, thanking her for what she had built. She smiled, engaged in polite conversation. But she knew who she was really waiting for. And then, finally, he came. Michael. She sensed him before she saw him, the familiar weight of his presence hovering just behind her. When she turned, he was there, standing stiffly, his hands buried in his pockets, his jaw clenched. He didn't look like the confident, polished man from before. He looked unsteady. Mom, he started. Helen let out a slow breath. She had imagined this moment for years. Had imagined yelling at him, breaking down, demanding answers. But now, she felt none of that. Michael, she said simply. His throat bobbed. Can we talk? She studied him, searching his face for the boy she used to know. The boy who used to hug her after school, who used to insist on staying up late to help her fold laundry just so they could talk. That boy wasn't here anymore. But maybe, just maybe, something of him still remained. Helen nodded. All right. Let's talk. They found a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the lingering crowd. The weight between them was heavy, years of silence pressing into the space like a physical force. Michael hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked like he had 1,000 things to say but no idea where to start. I didn't expect to see you here, he finally admitted. Helen let out a dry chuckle. No, I imagine you didn't. His eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe. I didn't know about the scholarship. She raised an eyebrow. Because you never asked. Michael flinched. Mom, he stopped, exhaling sharply. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. Helen didn't respond. She let him sit in the weight of his own words. He swallowed hard. I didn't know how to fix it. Helen tilted her head, watching him. You didn't even try. Michael's gaze dropped to the floor. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, finally, he spoke again, so quietly she almost missed it. I was ashamed. She blinked, taken aback. Ashamed? He nodded, his shoulders stiff. Of where I came from. Of how people would see me if they knew. Do you know how many times I heard things like, oh, you must have come from money to afford Harvard? Or your parents must be so proud, what do they do? His hands clenched. And every time I had a choice. Tell them the truth, that my mom was a janitor, that I only made it because she worked herself to the bone, or let them assume I belonged. Helen's chest tightened. I was tired of being the poor kid. Tired of feeling like I had to explain why I was there. He exhaled, shaking his head. So I let them believe whatever they wanted. And eventually, I guess I started believing it too. Helen let his words settle. For years, she had assumed his silence was indifference, that he had outgrown her, discarded her like a chapter of his life he didn't want to revisit. But it hadn't been indifference. It had been shame. A different kind of betrayal. But betrayal, nonetheless. She nodded slowly, her voice calm. You were embarrassed of me. Michael's face twisted. Mom, no, Don't lie, she cut in, her voice steady but sharp. Not now. He shut his mouth, looking away. She took a deep breath, her next words coming softer. You don't have to be proud of me, Michael. But I will never let you make me feel small for the life I lived. I won't let you decide what my sacrifices were worth. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes glassy. I never wanted to hurt you. She nodded. But you did. Silence. For the first time, Michael had nothing to say. The gala had ended. The ballroom was nearly empty now, waitstaff clearing away wine glasses and half-eaten desserts. Michael let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can fix this. Helen studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. That's not my answer to give. His brows furrowed. What do you mean? She gave him a small, sad smile. I've already made peace with my life. The question is, can you live with the choices you've made? Michael swallowed hard. For the first time, he was the one left behind. She reached out, squeezing his arm gently. Not in forgiveness. Not yet. But in acknowledgement. Then, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. This time, it was his choice to follow. Or not. Michael didn't call right away. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Helen didn't expect him to. But then, one evening, as she was locking up the community center where she ran her scholarship program, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. Michael. Her heart skipped. For a moment, she considered letting it ring, making him wait. But then, with a quiet sigh, she answered. "Hey, Mom," his voice was hesitant. "I was wondering if we could meet." Helen didn't smile. Didn't cry. She simply said, "Okay." Because sometimes, change didn't happen in a grand speech. Sometimes, it started with a single phone call. They met at a small coffee shop, neutral ground. Michael looked different. Less polished. Less sure of himself. He slid into the seat across from her. "I've been thinking a lot," he admitted. "About everything." Helen stirred her coffee. "And?" His throat bobbed. "I want to try again." She raised an eyebrow. "Try what, exactly?" His voice softened. "Being your son." Helen sat back, studying him. There was no guarantee. No instant forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. She took a slow sip of coffee. "All right," she finally said. "We'll see." Michael exhaled, nodding. For the first time in years, they sat together. Not as mother and son. Not as strangers. But as two people willing to try. And for Helen, that was enough. For now. Helen's story isn't just about a mother and a son. It's about sacrifice. About resilience. About learning that self-worth isn't defined by the people who forget us, but by the ones who remember. Too often, parents, especially single mothers, give everything for their children, only to be left behind when success comes knocking. But does that mean their love and sacrifice were in vain? Or does it mean they've given their children the wings to fly, even if it means flying away? This story also forces us to ask, can people truly change? Michael chose to erase his past, to turn away from the woman who built his future. But in the end, when confronted with his own choices, he had to decide, does he keep running, or does he try to make things right? Speech balloon, what do you think? Was Michael's redemption enough, or was his regret too little, too late? Do you believe Helen should have forgiven him, or was she right to move on without looking back? Comment below. Type 2 if you liked the story. Type 7 if you didn't. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to EN True Tales to hear more powerful, real-life inspired stories like this one. Natalie will be back with another gripping tale tomorrow, so make sure you turn on notifications. Your voice matters. Share your thoughts, and let's keep the conversation going.